Oh, the 90s. From vibrant neon colors to those free internet trial CDs you used to get in the mail, the 90s have now become iconic as being the last decade before computers, the internet, and social media
smoking these meats
took over the world. But when I think about the 90s, the first thing that comes to my mind is movies. And the thing about 90s movies is that they have a certain look and a certain feel to them. So in this video, just as we did with the 80s, we're going to dive into a few reasons why 90s movies feel like 90s movies. But before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to FilmStack if you haven't already, because we have a ton of cool videos planned and we wouldn't want you to miss out. So with that out of the way, cue the intro. So let's start with the visuals. 90s movies look different than the films of today. They have a certain crispness to them, but still manage to retain that grainy/natural feel. During the 90s, digital cameras weren't the mainstream just yet, and movies were still being shot on film. And the film stock during that decade reached a peak in terms of quality. This allowed cinematographers to capture the most crisp images with better lighting. And you could tell, 90s movies have a different look to them than the movies of the 80s. They tend to be less grainy. But because film was used, the colors were oftentimes more natural than what we see today, because it was much more difficult to color grade before we had all of the digital post-processing tools we have today. If you wanted to have a certain color tone to your movie, you would either have to use creative lighting, a colored lens filter, do it while processing the film by using a certain mixture of chemicals, or some combination of the techniques I just mentioned. The first film to be credited for being fully digitally color graded is Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, which was released in the year 2000. And you might be thinking, but Dom, I swear The Matrix was color graded green. And yes, it kind of was green. But that was because the Wachowskis used filters on their lenses with a green undertone. Digital color grading wasn't used en masse until about 2007 to 2010. And once it became used regularly, it started being overused in some situations, to the point where we even call some forms of color grading very cliche. Think of movies like Transformers, or really most Michael Bay movies, where they tend to have that teal and orange color tone to them. Almost every movie now uses some form of digital color grading, and when shooting with modern cameras, cinematographers tend to shoot in a very neutral/muted tone and add a lot of the color in post. But let's also talk about the lighting. During the 90s and in the decades prior, cinematographers used a lot of natural lighting. This often resulted in better shadows. That, combined with the higher quality film stock when compared to the previous decades, resulted in some really nice quality shots. Today, film productions tend to overly light their scenes to make it easier to do post-processing and CGI, which we'll talk about in a later section. This leads to shadows that aren't always as realistic as they should be, or shadows that have to be added or redefined in post. CGI was and continues to be a game changer in the film industry. Today, filmmakers can put almost anything they imagine onto the big screen. We see entire buildings, cities, worlds, and even galaxies created using CGI. Love it or hate it, I welcome it with open arms, because although most of my favorite movies use practical effects or lean heavily on the storytelling with no effects in sight, CGI has opened the doors to so many cool things that I'm sure many people who grew up before the 90s couldn't have even imagined. CGI really started to take shape in the 90s and took a big step towards what it has become today. Sure, computer-generated imagery can be dated back to the 70s, but it wasn't until the 90s when we started to see glimpses of what was possible. I'm talking about films like Jurassic Park, where we saw the true power of CGI bring dinosaurs to life with incredible scale for the first time ever. And throughout the 90s, unlike today, CGI was still used very sparingly, but it laid the foundation for continued development and improvements. The 90s were that tipping point of when we saw CGI really show us what it can do, but still before it was widely adopted. Some other notable movies that used CGI in the 90s were The Matrix and The Titanic.
Rockets explode!
Pixar. Enough said. Okay, I'm just kidding. But in all seriousness, when you think of Pixar movies, what decade do you think of? For me, it's the 90s. And even though they only released 3 movies during that decade, man oh man, it had such a huge impact on the film industry. In 1995, Pixar released the first ever full-length 3D animated film, Toy Story. Since then, 3D animated films have become a staple in our ever-growing catalog of films coming out each year. Heck, even a lot of TV shows are now fully 3D animated. Before the 90s, every movie out there was either live action or hand-drawn. Computers weren't popular enough or powerful enough to even consider making an entire film with them. But in the years leading up to Toy Story's release, Pixar was able to make that film with only 27 animators. Since then, technology has come such a long way that almost everyone with a computer and a particular set of skills could do some 3D animation. And the number of studios producing 3D animated films has grown, but one constant that hasn't changed since the 90s is that Pixar continues to be a leader in the space. They are continuously creating and developing new techniques and technologies to progress the medium forward. We decided to put 3D animation as one of the reasons 90s movies feel like 90s movies is because even though there weren't that many of them during that decade, they had such a huge impact on the industry and were such gems that contributed to the overall vibe of the 90s.
The ship is gonna suck us down. Take a deep breath when I say.
The 90s were a very special time when it came to big names in Hollywood. It was a decade where many of the big named actors and directors we see today had their come up. But it was also a decade where many of the big names of previous decades were still very active. It was almost as though the 90s were the decade where there was a passing of the baton from older generations to newer generations. Some of the big names that were still very active during the 90s were directors like Steven Spielberg and James Cameron. And we saw the introduction of ones like Quentin Tarantino and Wes Anderson. We also saw a ton of big named actors and actresses, from ones that were already famous like Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, Robin Williams, Julianne Moore, and Sigourney Weaver, to the ones that made their name in the 90s like Leonardo DiCaprio, Jim Carrey, Matt Damon, Ben Affleck, Cameron Diaz, Kate Winslet, and Charlize Theron, to name a few. You could really tell that the 90s were a powerhouse of big name celebrities. The 90s were also a time where traditional celebrities were hitting their peak of popularity. This was still true into the 2000s, but these days there are so many quote-unquote new types of celebrities like all of the influencers that we see. It was the last decade where the hype and obsession about celebrities was very much present, but all of these celebrities were just a mystery behind closed doors, unless their personal lives were being smeared on the front page of newspapers. We didn't have social media yet, and there was a certain feel to the celebrities from that decade. This is much different than today, where celebrities tend to interact with their fans so much more, and even give a certain glimpse into their personal lives. From 1989 to 1999, Disney returned to producing critically acclaimed and commercially successful animated films. This era of Disney is what we now refer to as the Disney Renaissance. During this time, the movie that Disney was producing were mostly musical adaptations of well-known stories. And this wasn't only a return to form, but it was also a return to its roots because it mimicked what Walt Disney did by adapting well-known stories during the 1930s to 1960s. As a 90s kid, Disney animated films were a huge part of my life and are a source of major nostalgia for me. The Little Mermaid, The Rescuers Down Under, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, The Lion King, Pocahontas, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Hercules, Mulan, and Tarzan. I dare you to try naming a more iconic and classic set of movies produced by another studio in such a short period of time. Maybe only Pixar can compare.
It was a teenage wedding and the old folks wished them well.
The 90s were also a time where indie films were on the rise, and their success was no longer just limited to film festivals, but also at the box office. Technology got to the point where you can make a full feature-length film for under $10 million, and studios decided to capitalize on this. Two of the biggest names in the independent film scene were New Line Cinema and Miramax Films. In the year 1990, New Line Cinema released the indie film Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I know, it's weird to even think of it as an indie film, but it was. This was the most successful independent film to that point, grossing over $100 million in the United States. But as with anything that is successful in the film industry, conglomerate Hollywood began trying to capitalize on this by acquiring the independent film studios. They even went on to create their own quote-unquote independent film studios. I know, it's kind of a surprise, but some of the indie studios owned by conglomerate Hollywood are Sony Pictures Classic, Searchlight Pictures, Paramount Vantage, among many more.
You're a big cop. Really funny.
And finally, we have what I call the nostalgia factor. The 90s remind me, and I'm sure a lot of you, of simpler times. Times before every single house had the internet or even a computer. Way before smartphones and social media. A time where if you wanted to know how a movie was doing, you'd either have to check a newspaper or hear about it on a commercial. The nostalgia of the 90s is strong for me, and it impacts every movie I watch from that decade. This section was super short because there isn't really much to say about nostalgia, but I'm sure it has a really big part to play for why 90s movies feel like 90s movies. And there we have it. Thanks for watching. I really enjoyed making this video because it gave me so much nostalgia for that decade. I hope you enjoyed the video as much as I enjoyed making it, and if you know any other reasons why 90s movies feel like 90s movies, make sure to leave a comment below. I'd love to read it. If you haven't subscribed to FilmStack already, make sure to do so for more content like this. If you like this video, please leave a like, and until next time, have a good one.